want to start this morning by sort of taking us back, like I said, not as well as the kids did, but take us back into the first century, a bit into first century Palestine, and to what was going on in first century Palestine at the time. Talking about the Jews who were living there in Judea and Galilee, Roman provinces. Of course, they were living in an occupied land. They were under the control, they were really under the thumb of what was essentially a brutal power. The Romans did not really like the Jews because the Jews just refused to be Roman. Romans liked people who wanted to be like them. They were under the control and under the thumb of the Roman Empire. And of course, they had no self-determination. They were not in control of their own destiny. And they were waiting, they were looking for Messiah to come and to deliver them from this oppression. And the Romans were really, when you think about it, they were really just the next in a long line of oppressors and occupiers who had control of the land of Palestine, from the Babylonians through to the Persians, through to the Greeks, and now the Romans. And the thing was, though, whilst they were waiting and looking for this Messiah, there were a lot of different ideas and a lot of different perspectives about the reasons for this occupation. Why was it happening? What was the reason for their suffering? And a lot of different ideas about what the arrival of Messiah would and should look like. One group that we read a lot about was the Pharisees. They feature very heavily in the Gospels, obviously. And the Pharisees thought that the problem was that we had defiled ourselves with foreign influence. So they looked back at the scriptures like Ezra and Nehemiah, even further back than that, and they thought, okay, the problem is that we've allowed too much foreign influence to corrupt us. They looked back at scriptures where the Jews had intermarried with the groups around them and they'd adopted their gods and things like that. And they said, oh, you know what? Our problem is we've been defiled. We've compromised with these foreign powers. And so foreign invasion and oppression was the consequence. That was like it was like straight from the ironic punishments division, you corrupt yourself with foreign influences. Well, I'll have you invaded by foreigners to show you what that's actually like. And so that was the way. There's a lot of that in the Hebrew Bible. A lot of the Old Testament texts really do paint it just that way. And so the Pharisees thought, well, the solution to this problem is that we need to separate ourselves from foreign influence. We need to purify the nation. And by the way, the Pharisees were really, it doesn't come out much in some of the histories we have, but they were really into pure blood. They did not like mixed blood. They liked pure-blooded Israelites. They considered themselves to be pure-blooded Israelites. And so their idea was, we have to purify the nation of foreign influences. And in the interactions that we read about between Jesus and the Pharisees, and with the early Christians as well, in like the book of Acts, what is it that the Pharisees are concerned about? What routinely comes up? Well, circumcision comes up a lot in the book of Acts, we see. Keeping the Sabbath comes up in a lot of gospel texts. They're very angry with Jesus because they don't think that he keeps the Sabbath properly. Ritual purity, like kosher food laws and washing hands before you eat and things like that. Keeping the law. Why these things? Why the Sabbath? Why circumcision? Why ritual purity? Why the law? Well, it's because these are the markers of Jewish identity. These are the things that set them apart from foreigners, from the foreign nations from around them, from the Romans. These are the things that say, we are Jewish. And that's why the Pharisees were supremely concerned with these particular things. They were the markers of Jewish identity. And so once Israel sort of kept these markers strong, drew their line in the sand, kept the law, purified themselves, then God would respond by sending Messiah. And that was sort of the deal the Pharisees had figured out, or thought they'd figured out. And many believed that when this Messiah would come, that he would take vengeance upon the foreign oppressors, that he would exact vengeance upon the Romans for all the oppression and suffering that they had caused. Now, the Pharisees were one group. Like I said, there were many ideas floating around. Pharisees were one group. They were a very popular group. The people loved the Pharisees, by the way. They were a very, very popular group of people at the time. But they weren't the only group in town. There were also the Zealots. I think, if I remember right, Josephus calls them the fourth philosophy, sort of a fourth group that he talks about. There were members of the Zealots who we call the Sicarii. And the Sicarii translates to dagger men, because these guys would like sneak up on you in the marketplace and pull these daggers out of their cloaks and stab you in the back. That's what they would do. So you can see that they kind of went a step further than the Pharisees. They didn't think the Pharisees really went far enough. Let's not just wait for the Messiah to come and exact vengeance. Let's exact our own vengeance right now. And that was the way that they went about it. Let's not wait for Messiah to purify the nation. Let's do it ourselves. Let's purify the nation through violent retribution and revolution, and by taking up arms against the Romans. And not just the Romans, but anybody who liked the Romans. They were just as good at stabbing who they thought were collaborators in the back as they were stabbing Roman soldiers in the back. In other words, the Zealots said, or the Sicarii said, let's become the Messiah that we're actually looking for. And the expectation for so many of these groups, really for the Pharisees and the Sicarii alike, the expectation, and I think Ben mentioned this last week, the expectation was for a Messiah who was a military strongman. All right? A Messiah who would come and mete out death and destruction and vengeance. And that's what a lot of people at the time were looking for and were hoping for. Now, in this season, in this Advent season, we anticipate the return of the Messiah. That's my Christmas tree, by the way. I thought it was pretty, so I put it on. Yeah. It has light, it's got lots of light. And light will feature heavily in today's talk. And this is, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this is the Advent week where we talk about light. Is that right? Somebody will correct me if I'm wrong. I should have looked before I came. I didn't. But in this season, we do anticipate the return of the Messiah. That's really, honestly, what the Advent season is all about. We anticipate his return by reflecting on his first coming, on his first Advent. But, it has to be said that sometimes similar imagery to that first century sort of warlike imagery is often used about this eventual second coming. And I think we all have seen that. We get this imagery oftentimes of a vengeful warrior dealing out wrath and destruction and torment, riding in on a white horse and slashing everybody with his sword. And that kind of thinking can easily turn anticipation into fear. Into fear. So much so that we don't actually look forward to the return of Jesus. So much so that people actually look at that return or look towards that return with dread and might want to delay it as long as possible. You just give us a few minutes to tidy up. And go, oh, not right yet. We're sort of just a bit longer. Yeah, and so it might be this idea of trying to actually push this thing off because we don't want to see it, because it sounds dangerous and deadly and vengeful. In the Revelation series that we did, what was that, term 2 or term 3? Earlier in this year, we tried to address some of that imagery that's often used, like for instance this image right here, the rider on the white horse image from Revelation 19. I'll say that on the YouTube channel, on the YVV YouTube channel, I think it's still there. I think those Revelation talks are still there. So you can look at some of those teachings about this particular passage if you like. And we try to address that in a sensible way. But today, I want to come at this idea from a different angle by looking at my favorite Advent passage. My favorite Advent passage. It's in John 1. Now, if you have your Bibles or your devices, you can turn to John 1. If you are on like level 7,621 of Candy Crush, but you haven't found time to download some Bible software, in a supreme act of grace towards you, I have Hi, if you don't know, my name's Adzi. I work in sarcasm, the way other artists work in paints or clays. It's my true medium. Anyway, if that's you, just don't worry. I've got the scriptures. I've got them up. The scriptures that we're going to read. They'll all be up on the screen. So don't stress. Yeah, put it away, Beth. You won't need it. You won't need it. If you are going to read along and you're getting yourself situated, I'll just say while we're turning there, Matthew and Luke. We often turn to Matthew and Luke at Christmas time because Matthew and Luke have the sort of the birth narratives, right? They're the two gospels with actual birth narratives of the birth of Jesus. They're called the synoptic gospels, and we call them this. There's Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptics because it's called the synoptics because we see them together. That's what it kind of means, to see them together, because they all emerge from basically the same tradition. They tell a lot of the same stories. They use a lot of the same language. They share a lot of material. But John is different. John emerges from a different community, a different tradition. So when you read John, you can see right away it's not the same as Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's a very different take on things, very different perspective, but a beautiful one nonetheless that complements the synoptics very, very well. And the prologue to John, that's John 1, verses 1 to 18. We call that the prologue. That's this writer's take on the Advent. And so I'm going to read bits of that this morning. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. I'm going to skip around a bit, so I'll try to tell you kind of where I'm going. And there's a lot in here, so we can't obviously talk about it all. But starting in John 1, verse 1. And let me actually put it on the screen for you so that you can see it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and without him, not one thing came into being. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humanity. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave the power to become children of God, who were born not of blood, or of the will of the flesh, or of the will of man, but of God, not of blood. In other words, Pharisees, you're wrong. And the Word became flesh and pitched his tent in our midst. And that's literally what it says there, by the way. Eskanosen in hemin means to pitch your tent. It references sort of the Old Testament tabernacle, really. I don't really have time to talk about that. The Word became flesh and pitched his tent in our midst. And we have seen his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. From his fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. The law, indeed, was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Now, there's so much richness in this passage. I mean, there's so many. Like, we could go down 100 rabbit trails here. It would take a few weeks. It would take more than a few weeks just to talk about these 18 verses. But the one that I really want to focus on for our purposes this morning is verse 18. Verse 18 says this. Is it up on the screen? Yes. No one has ever seen God. God, the only begotten, who is in the Father's bosom, he has revealed God. And I love this verse, and I want us to focus on this verse. No one has ever seen God. Not Abraham, not Moses, not the priests of Israel, not the prophets, not the Old Testament writers. Not any of them. It is God, the only Son, who is, as it says, literally in the Father's bosom. Sometimes it's translated, who is close to the Father's heart, but the real Greek means in the Father's bosom. It is the only Son who has made God known. I think it's easy sometimes when we read certain scriptures, like, for instance, these passages we're talking about on the coming of the Lord, on the second coming of Jesus. It's easy when we read these scriptures, or people's interpretations of these scriptures, if you like, to see God as a harsh and vindictive being. Sometimes it seems to present itself that way. And I think this is a little side note. I'll just say this, though. It's important that we recognize that oftentimes these passages we're reading are written by people who are themselves rather harsh and coming from a harsh culture and maybe interpreting things that way. But we must remember it is Jesus who shows us what God is really like. I'm going to say that again. It is Jesus who shows us what God is really like. Now, if you know me, you will know, I'm going to say this just to back myself in here. If you know me, you know I love the scriptures. I love them. But a small collection of 66 books that will fit into your hand could in no way contain all that is God. Right? I'm going to say that again because that's important. A small library of books cannot possibly contain all that is God, and cannot possibly give us an understanding on its own of God. And I think it's important that we recognize that. That's why Jesus came. That's why he came, to show us what God is really like. And so what is Jesus like? How do the Gospels portray him? How does he treat people that he meets? How does he treat those around him? How does he treat his enemies? What are our own personal experiences of Jesus in our own life? What are they like? What are our experiences with him like? What do we know him to be? And when we come face to face with that, we then look at some of this sort of violent and vengeful imagery that people associate with his second coming. And we have to ask ourselves, this Jesus with kind of a multiple personalities disorder who comes the first time one way and comes the second time in a completely different way. And we have to ask ourselves, this guy who rides in and take names and slashes people and exterminates them, does that make sense? Does it make sense? Does it jive with anything we know about Jesus? Does it fit the Jesus that we know? Now, I think it's pretty obvious from me asking that rhetorical question that I think the answer is no. But then we have to kind of bring ourselves to this next thing when we ask, well, okay, what about judgment? We can't pretend that the Gospels don't talk about judgment. They certainly do. They certainly do. The Gospels actually have quite a bit to say about judgment, and especially the book of John. John's no exception. Judgment is actually a major theme in the book of John. And I'd encourage you, this is a side, but I'd encourage you to read through, and if you can do it like in the next week, awesome. Read through the whole book of John. It's not that long. You can do it. The whole book, and as you're reading, think about it like this, because as a literary work, the whole book of John is actually set out like a trial. The whole thing is a trial. Now, we have the trial of Jesus at the end. That's true of all the Gospels. But actually, the book of John as a whole is a trial. Jesus is in the dock, and he is being quizzed. And it's being asked, the question is being asked, is this the Messiah? Jesus is in the dock. He's under judgment, if you like. And throughout the book, witnesses are called forward to testify that he is the Messiah. And signs and evidence are given. In fact, in John, they are called signs. They're not called miracles. They're actually called signs because that's what they're for. They're testifying to the fact that he is the Messiah. And so all the evidence is given that indeed he is. This is the one. But what becomes clear in the midst of that trial is that actually the tables are turned and that it's actually the world that's on trial for its deeds and for its unbelief. And here's how we're going to look at how that trial actually plays out. Here's how the trial plays out. It's actually in John 3. You can go there if you want. But we're going to read John 3:17 to 21. Now, we all know John 3:16. Beautiful verse, gets overused and sort of like, familiarity breeds contempt kind of a thing. But if you go past 3:16 to 17 to 21, there's this sort of beautiful passage about what the trial of the world or what the judgment of the world looks like. It says this: "Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but so that through him the world might be saved. The one who believes in him is not judged. The one who does not believe has already been judged, because that one has not believed in the name of the only Son of God. And this is the verdict. The light has come into the world, and people loved the darkness rather than the light, because their deeds were evil. For all who do evil hate the light and do not come to the light, so that their deeds may not be exposed. But those who do what is true come to the light, so that it may be seen that their deeds have been done in God." Now, there's a few things I really love about this passage that I want to highlight and bring out. First of all, number one, the most obvious thing: Jesus comes to rescue the world, not to judge it. It's very clear. I mean, it says it. So it's not like I need to talk about that too much. It's actually people that judge themselves. People pass their own judgment upon themselves. They judge themselves by the choices that they make. They judge themselves by the choice they make with Jesus and what they do with him. What they do with Jesus shows who they really are. And the second thing I love about this passage, and that I'd love to bring out, and I really want us to focus on this: judgment is not punishment. I'm going to say that again. Judgment is not punishment. Oftentimes in your translations, you might have this: the word condemn is used. And you get a translation that looks like this: God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but so that through him the world might be saved. You get a lot of that. And using that word, condemn, translating it that way, makes it sound like punishment, doesn't it? It sounds that way. But the word that's used here is the word krino. And krino is used all over the place in John. Most of the time, when that word or its derivatives, basically I should say that word and its derivatives have to do with making a decision. That's what it means, to make a decision. In this case, to make a legal decision, like a judge passing a verdict. All right? And that word is used a lot in John, krino, and its derivatives. It's never, like in other places, people don't translate it as condemn. So I'm not sure why they feel like they need to translate it that way here. That's not safe. That's not safe translation. Safe translation is to use the context and translate it in a similar or equal way throughout the book. In the context of this passage and in the context of John, I don't think condemn is a very safe translation. I wouldn't translate it that way. In fact, there are many translations that don't translate it that way. They translate it just the way I have it here, which is judge. All right? God did not send the Son in the world to judge the world. Right? The one who believes in him is not judged. The one who does not believe has already been judged. I think judge is a better word, is a better translation. And many, I should say, it's not just me, I'm not coming up with this myself. Many scholars have written about this very thing and say the same thing, that condemn is not a great translation. Here, to me, it's clear that and again, not just to me, but many scholars will say, it's clear what the judgment is. The judgment is a verdict. It's a verdict on the nature of the world. And here's the verdict. It says that. Here's the verdict. They loved darkness rather than light. That's the judgment. What is judgment? Judgment is bringing things to light. Judgment is showing us the truth about ourselves and about our actions. Judgment is calling what is wrong, wrong, and calling what is right, right. That's what judgment is. And many people don't like that, all right? If you live in darkness, you don't like that. Many people don't like that because they don't want the truth of their actions to be revealed. And watching sort of political maneuverings of the past few years and the past few weeks even, we see this in people. They do not like the truth of their actions to be revealed. So it makes sense what Jesus says here. If you live in darkness, you don't want to come to the light. Now, in saying all of that, look, I hope my purpose today, and I hope this is where we can go, I hope that we can change this morning some of our attitudes about judgment. Because really, the biblical view of judgment, and this is a safe thing to say, the biblical view of judgment is predominantly positive. It's actually a positive thing. And you can understand this if you just think with me. If you imagine a poor widow living in an ancient Jewish village, right? You got that picture in your head? A poor widow living in an ancient Jewish village. Her husband has just passed away, and along comes this very powerful and very wealthy landowner that tries to sort of take possession of her property using unscrupulous means. This kind of thing would happen. And of course, no one in the village there, no one comes to her defense because they're all afraid that that very powerful person will turn upon them if they come to this woman's defense. So she has no one to stand up for her. She has no one to defend her. She has no one to take her part. But finally, an itinerant judge, and that's the way the judges used to work in ancient Israel. They used to sort of travel around to different villages and hear trials and give judgments. And finally, an itinerant judge comes through the village, and he hears her case, and he finds in favor of the woman. He says that the wealthy man is in the wrong, right? That wealthy landowner has done the wrong thing. He's publicly shamed, and that's an awful thing in that culture. He is publicly shamed before everyone, and her property, she's vindicated, and her property is restored. And you can see that for someone like that, in that situation, judgment is awesome. You are looking forward to judgment. You are saying, I cannot wait to get the judgment that I deserve. I can't wait to be vindicated. And we do see this in the scriptures. We see this in Old Testament scriptures like Isaiah. This is Isaiah 11, 3-5. This is what we call a messianic passage. It's the passage about the branch that shoots from the root of Jesse. It's definitely a messianic passage. This is what the passage says. He, the Messiah, the coming branch, he shall not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. So it's the poor, the people on the lowest rungs of society, that would look forward to judgment. They would look forward to judgment. And I'm saying this morning, and I hope this is coming out, I'm saying we should also look forward to judgment. Judgment is a good thing. It's good. It is good. That what is wrong is declared to be wrong. It's good that exploitation and oppression and greed and racism and hatred and violence, it's good that that kind of thing is called out for what it is and declared to be wrong. And that the people who have practiced those things are shown to be wrong. And honestly, we would not think that God was a good God if he did not do this. That's what I think. I mean, feel free to disagree with me, but I think that's true. We would not think that God was a good God if he did not do this. If God just simply said, yeah, it's cool. That's fine. That's okay. Don't worry about it. Now remember, I'm not saying punishment, but I am saying judgment. It is a different thing. It is a good thing that God says what you did was wrong. Even in my own life, and I hope you can agree with me on this, I find that liberating for me when either it could be God, it could be the voice of the Spirit, or it could be someone speaking with the voice of the Spirit to me saying, that's wrong. What you're doing there is not right. I personally find that very liberating. It shows you, it shows you the truth. And once you recognize the truth, you can make changes. It is good that wrong is declared to be wrong. It is good that right is declared to be right. It is good that real justice is done on earth. It is good that real justice can finally be done on earth. See, at that eventual coming of Jesus that we look forward to, everything will be revealed. Everything will be brought to light. And when what's wrong is brought to light, only then can things actually be changed. Only then can things actually be healed and restored. The wrong has to be dealt with first. And so the return of Jesus, that return that we are anticipating and looking forward to, and whatever form of judgment that follows that return, means really that everything is about to be set right, that everything is about to be healed and about to be redeemed, that the world is about to be restored the way it was meant to be, and that light will finally eliminate all darkness. And that's a beautiful thing. It really is a beautiful thing. Now look, here's where I kind of want to go. I would like us, and don't move, like don't be like my kids, like my grade 5 kids who I say, okay, here's what I want to do. Can you get into groups? And right away they start milling around. Like, you have not even heard the instructions yet. Will you just chill and wait, right? Can I finish my set of instructions, and then you can follow them all at once? Don't be like them. Don't be like that. What I'd like to do is I would like to gather in groups. Just the people around you, But I want to. I understand a lot of times, and I've had to struggle with this in my own life. Like I really have. So that's why I want to bring a message like this morning. I've had to struggle a lot with ideas of fear and condemnation around the idea of judgment, and had really to kind of have to deal and sort of work through feelings and senses of fear about the coming of Jesus. There was a long time where I was one of those people would not have anticipated that. So look, you may be in a similar place this morning. You might be. You might have a lot or some fears around that eventual return, which could be today, could be tomorrow, could be, in a minute or two. You might not even have time to gather up in groups. Who knows? You never know. You just never know. But you may have some fears around that, right? You might, and that's very normal. I think in a church, it's very normal to have that. I think that's been built up over a long time. But I'd like to sort of address that this morning in our groups. Think about these things. You might want to sort of talk about these things before you pray for each other, but that's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to pray for each other, for those, especially for those who have need to bring some of that fear up before God and allow Him to deal with that in a loving way. And you might want to start by sort of talking about what have your feelings around judgment been, this idea of judgment. What have your feelings around this eventual coming of Jesus a second time? What have your feelings around that been? Has there been any fear that's either under the surface or right on the surface over that? And then, how easy or difficult, I guess, is it to see judgment as a good thing? Can we start to see a little bit of that this morning? So I'd like just to give you the chance to pray for each other in those respects. Right, around that fear that may have been built up over time, and around, hopefully, a bit of, I don't want to say enlightenment, but a bit of just opening our eyes to the idea of the goodness of God's judgment, right? And the love of God's judgment, because there's love in there too. Make sense? All right, those are my instructions. Now you can group up. Yeah.